All right, guys, welcome back for section 7.2. This section is about the kind of controversies and political fallout of the response, the U.S. government response to 9/11. Okay, as I said in a previous section, 9/11 changed a lot in U.S. culture. If you're old enough to remember it, I bet you'd agree with me. It changed a lot. And we did a lot of things after 9/11 in an attempt to stop terrorism and fight the bad guys that are controversial, right? That's the nice way to put it. So here's a list of some of those. This is not all of them. This is just some of them. Some of these really started before 9/11, but 9/11 made them a bigger deal, or you know, they change or shed some light on the controversy after 9/11, even though it was technically older. But these were the big things in the years since that we've kind of focused on and looked at. And anyway, so starting with unlawful combatants. So prior to 9/11, if you were in a war zone, there was basically two kinds of people. There were the enemy military, who were wearing a uniform, and the U.S. military would shoot those people. And then there were civilians, which there were rules about how you treated each one, right? Let's say we captured a member of a foreign military group. There were rules that we'd all agreed to follow, these giant international treaties, the most famous being the Geneva Conventions. There were lots of rules about how we had to treat military personnel from other countries that we captured during time of war. There was also just as long of a list about the rules for treating civilians that we captured in time of war. But those were basically your two choices. If you captured somebody in a war zone, they were either a military member and entitled to these rights and this kind of treatment, or they were a civilian and they were entitled to these rights and this kind of treatment, all dictated by these giant international treaties. After 9/11, the Bush White House kind of created this weird third group called Unlawful Combatants that weren't quite military and they weren't quite civilian. And none of those treaties discussed how to what the rules were for treating unlawful combatants. The Geneva Conventions say nothing about unlawful combatants. They only say something about the military people and the civilians. So this unlawful combatant group had there was no guidance about what we should do with these people. And the Bush White House was very controversial because they decided to do things to these unlawful combatants that they were not legally allowed to do to military or civilian people captured in a war zone. One of those things was what they called enhanced interrogation. And what enhanced interrogation, it's just a fancy word that means torture. Okay? The most famous kind of enhanced interrogation was waterboarding. And lots of government officials came out after it was discovered that we were waterboarding terrorists to try to get information out of them. And said, oh, waterboarding is not torture. Waterboarding is not torture. Well, they lied. Waterboarding is torture. In World War II, after World War II, we tried and convicted people of torturing American soldiers because they waterboarded American soldiers. Right? People were tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison or sentenced to death after World War II because they had tortured our soldiers by waterboarding them. So we went from waterboarding is definitely torture after World War II to, waterboarding is not torture, waterboarding is not torture in the early 21st century, which was crap. So these unlawful combatants were in this weird legal limbo where they could be waterboarded, and because they weren't military and they weren't civilians, there was no international treaty about whether you could waterboard them or not, right? Another big deal was rendition. Okay, rendition was basically the process of if we capture this person, we bring them back to the United States, we're going to have to, they're entitled to certain rights and certain treatment, and we're not allowed to do this and we're not allowed to do that. So why don't we capture them and then just give them to these other countries that don't have those rules, right? Some of our allies in the war on terror are a little less restrained by morality, if you will, than we are. So we'll capture them, give them to these other countries, they'll torture them, do all kinds of horrible stuff to them, and give us back any intelligence they collect. So it's kind of an indirect violation of these treaties that we signed. And that was very, very, very controversial. Like us giving prisoners we had captured to these other countries, knowing that they would have this really horrible stuff done to them. When we did capture people, we brought them back to either the United States or one of our foreign military bases. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, was one of the big places where they brought some of these captured, accused terrorists. Instead of giving these people a civilian trial, which, terrorism is a crime, so if we're accusing them of being terrorists, they should be, the view or the controversy, one side said, look, if these people are terrorists, terrorism is a crime, let's bring them to court, give them a lawyer, have a court case, convict them, and send them to prison for terrorism. And the military said, no, can't do that. But we'll compromise with you and we'll do a military tribunal, which is essentially, it's similar to a trial, but it's run by the military, it's secret, it has vastly different rules, the defendants don't have nearly the same amount of rights. So there was a controversy about whether these accused terrorists that we captured in these foreign areas deserved a full trial, or whether they it was enough due process to give them just the military tribunal. Because keep in mind, the Constitution does not grant rights. The Constitution recognizes rights that are inherent in people. It's the government recognizing that because you're a person, you have these rights. And even if they have never set foot on American soil, if we captured them in Afghanistan and brought them back to Cuba, they're still people, right? The fact that they're not U.S. citizens, the fact that they're not on U.S. soil, that doesn't make them any less people, and thus the Constitution still applies. Anyway, right after 9/11, they passed the Patriot Act, and Patriot is some, what's the word I'm looking for? It's where each letter means a different thing. Acronym. Patriot is an acronym for something. I can't remember what it is. It doesn't matter. But the Patriot Act, it had a lot of different sections in it, and a lot of those sections were very controversial. A lot of those sections dealt with, say, things that the government was allowed to do warrantless surveillance on certain people, right? So essentially, after the Patriot Act, they said, we don't need a warrant, or we don't need a full warrant, we just need this other kind of warrant. It made the legal requirements to surveil people much lower, and that was very, very controversial. But there were lots of different sections of the Patriot Act, and some of those sections have since gone away. Either they were voted out, or there was a sunset clause, or whatever. Some were changed, some are still there. But the Patriot Act today, almost 20 years later, is very, 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 very different than the Patriot Act as it was passed in 2001. It's been added to, deleted from, changed, modified, all these different things. And it is very different today. Some of the sections, kind of the American public was very upset about, so the U.S. government was like, yeah, we should get rid of that. So they got rid of that. But then they added in a new section, which was a similar but different. Anyway, Patriot Act is very different today than it was back then. But it is still controversial. It still gives the government powers that a lot of people believe they shouldn't have. But a sunset clause, which I mentioned there in my discussion of the Patriot Act, is just kind of an automatic expiration date for laws. A lot of times, if passing a law is controversial, and one side in Congress needs kind of help to get enough votes to pass the bill, one way they can do that is by adding this expiration date to the law, right? So a sunset clause basically says either this whole law or this section of the law is going to expire and no longer be enforceable after however many years. You know, sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 10 years, whatever. And then there's no action that needs to be taken to repeal that law. In fact, if you want to continue the law, you have to take action and do something, and there's a vote, right? So a sunset clause is just an expiration date for a law, and these are commonly used. Like in the mid-90s under Bill Clinton, they passed an assault weapons ban. And the only way they could get that passed was if they put in a 10-year sunset clause. So 10 years later, it's the mid-2000s, George Bush is president, and the Republicans are in control of Congress, and they just let it expire. They didn't have to repeal it, they didn't have to get rid of it, they just let it expire because the sunset clause was already built in. The threat advisory is the thing I talked about in section 7.1. That was that really, really stupid, like, what is the threat of terrorism right now? And it went from, I want to say, blue to green to yellow to orange to red. And it was dumb for two reasons. One, I don't think in the years that it was around, I don't think I ever saw it outside of yellow and orange. It was just one of those two the entire time. It never got down to green or blue or whatever. It never went up to red. It was just yellow or orange the entire freaking time, which is stupid. But also, it didn't really tell you what to do. It's like, okay, we've gone from yellow to orange. What does that mean? Do we buy more duct tape? Do we hide it in our houses? Do we accuse our neighbors of witchcraft? What do we do? So it was dumb all around, and they finally got rid of it, which is very good. I was very happy that they got rid of that stupid thing because it was useless. We've developed smart passports, right? So I've actually got my passport right here. I'm going to pull that out and show you. There it is. Okay, so here's my passport, right? Inside the inner lining of this first page, it feels like cardboard or something, but there is actually in there an RFID chip, right? So now if somebody changes the information on my passport, they can go through and change the, you know, the birth date and the picture and all that stuff. But then when they try to actually use it, the security person at the airport is going to read on that RFID chip the old information, and they're going to look at what the RFID chip says, and they're going to look at what the writing on the thing says, and they'll be like, oh, that's different. He must have modified this passport to be to make it look like it's his instead of actually, you know, Kevin's. And that helps. It helps make passports a lot harder to forge and fake and modify. A lot of people don't like it because it's anytime there's an RFID chip involved, people get upset because people see RFID chips as intrusive and surveillance, and most people don't realize, like, an RFID chip, you can't read that from like a satellite. You can't even read that from across the room. You have to be within like 6 inches or 8 inches or something to really get a read off of an RFID chip. So it's not like they can, you know, track your movements with that passport based on, you know, following you in the car or following you via satellite or something. They, again, the only way to tell it's even there is to get within a few inches of it. A no-fly list, essentially, so after 9/11, the United States got this list of like suspected terrorists, people we didn't want on planes, and said, okay, these people are no longer allowed to fly. And the vast majority of them were probably bad guys or terrorists or whatever, but a lot of people made it onto that list, and there's no real reason for them to. Like, they're not terrorists, they had no bad guy plans or whatever. So how they got on the no-fly list was questionable. And then once you're on the no-fly list, there was basically very little to no due process to get off the no-fly list. There was no, you couldn't like, call up a judge and say, hey, judge, I'm on the no-fly list. Can you take me off? And, there was no hearing you could go to. There was no appeals process. It was just, no, once you're on the no-fly list, you can't fly. Sorry. So that upset a lot of people. And again, the vast majority of the people on that list were probably people that should not have been flying. But some people who got mixed up in that, and that caused a lot of ruckus and concern. Racial profiling. Racial profiling is one of the biggest controversies, not just post 9/11, but kind of in American history. Police, law enforcement of all kinds have, I think, indisputably profiled people based on race, right? So everybody was freaking out every time they saw a Muslim person or an Arabic person go on board a plane. People freaked out after 9/11, right? Because it's like, oh, they look like a terrorist. That's racial profiling. And it's bad enough when civilians do it, but when law enforcement does it and there's real world legal consequences, that's even worse, right? So there was also a racial profiling controversy like in Arizona. There was a sheriff, Joe Arpaio, who in fact got tried and convicted for racial profiling and ignoring a court order to stop racial profiling. He continued to profile Hispanics in his little area of Arizona. And law enforcement obviously does racial profiling with African Americans. The fact that it happens, I don't think, is disputable. Some people, in the case of terrorism racial profiling, tried to argue that it's valuable, it's useful. Why shouldn't we target Arabic people for extra law enforcement screening? Why shouldn't we target Arabic people for this and that? I mean, it's the Arabic people who are the terrorists, right? Completely ignoring the fact that the vast majority of terrorists in the United States are white men, not Arabic. But that racial profiling is a common problem in law enforcement. So to give you an idea, a little evidence for racial profiling, they've done studies that show that all races, whites, African Americans, Hispanic people, Asian people, all races basically smoke and sell marijuana at basically the same rate, right? So African Americans are, I want to say, 12% of the U.S. population. They comprise, 12 or 13% of the people who smoke and sell marijuana, right? But guess which group gets arrested more for possession and sale of marijuana? When they're arrested, guess who gets punished more for smoking and selling marijuana? African Americans, right? So there is definitely a racial bias going on. There's some kind of racial profiling. There's some kind of racial something going on there. Is the problem on the part of the police? Is the problem on the part of communities? Is the problem a part of the legal system, the court system? I don't know. But there is definitely something going on there that is having a very disparate racial impact. Use of force is another big controversial area for law enforcement before 9/11, but especially after 9/11. What amount of force should police be using? Should police, at what time, at what instigation should police use chokeholds? At what instigation should the police use a baton or pepper spray or a taser or deadly force? Deadly force has had a lot of court cases about it. It's had a lot of focus, but that also means it's the most well-defined. And we talked about it in an earlier section where basically your police are only allowed to use deadly force when they or some other third party are in imminent threat of death or great bodily injury. But those lower level uses of force, those are a little murkier about when those are appropriate and when they're not appropriate. And that can result in people dying. There was a case in New York where a guy was selling cigarettes or something illegally, and the cops came up to him and tried to arrest him, and one of them put him in a chokehold, and the guy died because of the chokehold. So that kind of use of force policy is very controversial. We need to, as a society and as a law enforcement community, figure out exactly when different levels of force should be used. And more importantly, we need to focus on de-escalating situations so that use of force doesn't even become a question, right? If we can stop these violent incidents before they even become violent incidents, use of force becomes moot, right? Another big controversy, mandatory arrests, right? So there are certain cases in which police are legally required to arrest someone. So kind of the go-to example there is in many states, not all, in many states, domestic violence. If police show up to a domestic violence situation, whether it's husband and wife or two roommates or brother and sister or father and son, whatever, if one of the two people has injuries, bruises, cuts, bleeding somewhere, whatever, the police are legally required to arrest the other person. There are some studies of these laws that show that they do, in fact, reduce recidivism for domestic violence. There are other studies that show that they increase recidivism for domestic violence. So that's definitely an area where we need more study. A lot of people like those laws. A lot of people don't like those laws. But it's definitely falling under one of those controversial areas. And then finally, body cameras. Body cameras, basically, if you ask people what they think about body cameras, everybody loves them. Law enforcement likes them. Civilian likes them. The media likes them. Everybody loves law enforcement body cameras. The problem is, how do you implement them? That is a much more complicated issue than people tend to realize. So first off, there's the cost of the cameras. Then there's the cost of training people to use the cameras. Even if they're very, very simple, you still need to take, say, an hour per officer to teach them how to use it and what the policies are and what the laws are and what this is and what that is. That costs time and money. Then there's the cost of storing the video. Then there's the cost of, getting the video to court when it needs to get to court. There's the cost of batteries, and there's the electricity cost. It becomes a very expensive proposition. It becomes even more expensive if you're talking about recording video for an officer's entire shift. So let's say they're on a 12-hour shift. Should that body camera run for all 12 hours? Well, at some point during that 12-hour shift, the officer is going to go to the bathroom. Do we have a legal right as a society to expect law enforcement officers to wear that body camera into the bathroom and record themselves going to the bathroom? Do we have a right to record officers when they're sitting in their car driving around on patrol and their wife or husband calls them and they have a private conversation on the phone in the car alone? Do we have the right to ask them or demand that they record that? If we don't have them record all 12 hours or 8 hours or however long of their shift, when do we ask them to record? Is it any interaction with the public that we think they should record? Is it any investigation that we think they should record? What are the punishments for failing to turn on the camera? What are the punishments for, if the camera actually breaks, how do we tell it's actually broken versus the police officer didn't want to record themselves doing something wrong, so they broke it, right? How long do we keep the video, right? So if, an officer comes back, turns in his video, it's stored, should we store it for 6 months? Should we store it for 1 month? Should we store it for a year? If it becomes part of a case, we should obviously store it longer, but how much longer? Should we store the entire shift worth of video or only that section that caused the controversy? Also, should cameras go on the chest? Should they go on the glasses? Should they go, where should they go? All these things are incredibly complicated. And I personally, I love the idea of body cameras, but it's going to take a few years before we kind of figure these things out and reach a point where the industry as a whole and law enforcement as a whole has kind of developed a standard operating procedure when it comes to these body cameras. And it will happen. It's just a question of working through what kind of the right thing to do is with those things. Anyway, that's the end of section 7.2. Thank you so much for watching. That is also the end of the law enforcement section. So section 8, we are starting our courts section. So I'll see you then.